Hello everyone and welcome to the Melbourne Traditionalists podcast episode 61. Over the last two episodes I've been talking about China's century of humiliation, and the century is not over. This is the third and final part of that three-part series. So without further ado, we'll move on to China 1916 to 1949. Between 1916 and 1949, China's history can be divided into four periods. 1916 to 1926, the Warlord period. 1927 to 1937, the Nanjing period, where the Kuomintang were in charge. 1937 to 1945, the Sino-Japanese War, which, while it started as a distinct war, merged with the Second World War. And 1945 to 1949, the end of the Chinese Civil War. In 1916, during the middle of the First World War, Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig requested about 21,000 labourers be recruited to fill the manpower shortage. Recruiting labourers from other countries was not something unusual at that time. Other than the Chinese, there were labour corps serving in France from Egypt, Fiji, India, Malta, Mauritius, the Seychelles, the British West Indies, as well as a native labour corps from South Africa. It was estimated that at the end of the war, over 300,000 workers from the colonies, 100,000 Egyptians, 21,000 Indians, and 20,000 native South Africans worked in France and the Middle East. As China was initially not a belligerent country, her nationals were not allowed by their government to participate in the fighting. Recruiting, however, began in 1916 for Chinese labourers to serve in France, and the first labourers left China in May of 1916. These men were recruited by the French government. British recruitment started later the same year. As a result, the early stage of the recruiting business in China was somewhat sketchy, with semi-official support from local authorities. However, after China declared war against Imperial Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire on the 14th of August 1917, the Labour Department of the Chinese government began organising the recruitment officially. A total of about 140,000 Chinese workers served on the Western Front during and after the war. Among them, 100,000 served in the British Chinese Labour Corps, about 40,000 served with the French forces, and hundreds of Chinese students served as translators. The workers were mainly aged between 20 and 35, and they served as labour in the rear echelons. They were tasked with carrying out essential work to support the frontline troops, such as unloading ships, building dugouts, repairing roads and railways, digging trenches and filling sandbags. Some worked in armaments factories, others in naval shipyards. The workers saw firsthand that life in Europe was far from ideal and reported this on their return to China after the war. Chinese intellectuals of the new cultural movement looked on their contribution to the war as a point of pride. China had declared war to curry favour with the Allied powers and to get their support against Japan, who were also one of the Allied powers. But both China and Japan were to be disappointed with the Treaty of Versailles. In the 1890s, Germany had obtained territory that in 1914 Japan had attacked and captured, meaning Chinese territory. Japan wanted to keep these territories and China wanted them returned. Japan had issued its 21 demands upon China in 1915, which, if China had accepted them, would have made it a colony of Japan. The other Allied powers had had the issue postponed until after the war. Japan had thought this meant that they would get their way. China had entered the war to try and get the 21 demands rejected, which the Allied powers did, angering Japan. But they allowed Japan to keep the territory it had captured from Germany, thereby angering China. In China, this led to what was called the 4th of May movement, named after student protesters that started on the 4th of May 1919 in protest at the Treaty of Versailles. These led to turning point in another important movement, which I've already mentioned, the New Culture movement, which turned a cultural movement into a political one. Many Chinese intellectuals were deeply dissatisfied with traditional Chinese culture and wanted to replace it with a hybrid of Western and Chinese culture, which rejected many of the features of traditional Confucian values while remaining Chinese. So they wanted study to be in vernacular literature, so in other words, in everyday language. They wanted an end to the patriarchal family in favour of individual freedom and women's rights. The view that China is a nation just like any other nation, and it's not uniquely Confucian. The re-examination of Confucian texts and ancient classics using modern textual and critical methods, such as what was called the Doubting Antiquity School. They wanted democratic and egalitarian values and an orientation to the future instead of looking back to the past. As you might be able to see, many of the ideas expressed here would become very prominent during the Cultural Revolution 50 years later. While all of this was going on, the warlords ruled in China. The central government had been weak under imperial rule. Now under the Republic, it was just as weak. It could be argued that the reason that imperial rule ended was because the warlords were already in charge, and once they withdrew their support, then it was the end of the empire and the start of the Republic. But that didn't mean that they rallied to support the Republic. Instead, they continued to offer support as it suited them, and to withdraw that support when it didn't. While a national government continued to exist, its real purpose was to represent China to the outside world, not to rule. It did have areas where it ruled, but in most of China it did not. Just to give you a taste of how confusing this period is, North and South China were ruled by different groups, and no group remained at the top for more than a few years. North and South China fought against each other, and factions within both the North and the South fought against each other. Provinces would act independently, and banditry was widespread. It is incredibly confusing, and that's why I'm going to skip over a lot of it and get to the reunification. In the South, Sun Yat-sen, who was the great revolutionary figure of the Revolution of 1911, returned to China, and he helped resurrect a party that had already existed called the Kuomintang, also known as the Nationalist Party. In 1923, he returned to power in the South and allied with the Soviet Union, and he created a party and military force capable of reuniting China. According to Sun Yat-sen's theory, the Kuomintang were to rebuild China in 3 phases. 1, a phase of military rule through which the Kuomintang would take over power and reunite China by force. 2, a phase of political tutorage. And 3, a democratic phase, a constitutional and democratic phase. To do this, the Kuomintang was organised along Soviet lines, complete with a Politburo. It was a revolutionary party that included the Communist Party of China, which had also been formed in 1923, as a part of it. Its focus was on unifying or reunifying China. 2 years later, in 1925, Sun Yat-sen died and was replaced as leader by Chiang Kai-shek, who had been in charge of training new army officers. He used this to form a loyal and competent officer corps with the help of the Soviet Union, who sent officers, including a general, and money and weapons. So they gave a lot of support to the Kuomintang. This support made the Kuomintang the best in China, and it began what was called the Northern Expedition in 1926, which would go until 1928. The first expedition began on the 9th of July 1926. Chiang gave a lecture to 100,000 soldiers of what was called the National Revolutionary Army in a ceremony that was the official commencement of the Northern Expedition. The National Revolutionary Army was set up by cadets trained in the Wupao Military Academy. its soldiers were far better organised than the warlord armies they faced due to their military advisors and being equipped with Russian and German weapons. So there was also a lot of trade in military equipment between China and Germany in this time. In addition, the National Revolutionary Army was regarded as a progressive force on behalf of ordinary people who were persecuted and mistreated by warlords, and the Revolutionary Army troops received a warm welcome and strong support from peasants and workers who suffered under the brutal rule of the warlords. It was no surprise that the National Revolutionary Army would march across China in 6 months and annihilate the main forces of the warlords in the area, in addition to increasing its own forces from 100,000 to 250,000. The Northern Expedition became a point of contention over foreign policy between Stalin and Trotsky. Stalin followed an opportunist policy, ignoring communist ideology when necessary. He told the Chinese Communist Party to stop complaining about the lower classes and follow the Kuomintang's orders. Stalin believed that the Kuomintang, middle and upper classes, would defeat the Western imperialists in China, which means the West, and complete the revolution. Trotsky wanted the Communist Party to complete an orthodox proletarian revolution, and he opposed the Kuomintang. Stalin funded the Kuomintang during the expedition, and he also countered Trotsky's criticism by making a secret speech in which he said that Chiang's right-wing Kuomintang were the only ones capable of defeating the imperialists that they were funding, and that he was also getting funding from rich merchants, and because of this he'd be able to utilise the Kuomintang until they were squeezed for all usefulness like a lemon before being discarded. Chiang, however, decided to purge all the communists from the Kuomintang. In the Shanghai massacre of 12th of April 1927, thousands of communists were executed or went missing, while others were arrested and imprisoned. The purge caused a split between the Kuomintang's left and right wings. The leftists, led by Wang Jingqiu in the Kuomintang capital of Wuhan, condemned Chiang's purge. Chiang, however, subsequently established his own capital in Nanjing. As a result, the Nationalist Party and its military forces were in a state of disarray during the summer of 1927, which allowed the warlords to reorganise and go on the offensive. Most of 1927 was defeat after defeat for the Kuomintang. But that led to exhaustion, and in 1928 the Kuomintang defeated the warlord armies, and China was now at least officially reunited. In reality, large warlord armies continued to exist, but they did not try to challenge the central government. Instead, they tried to rule their own local areas. Locally, the warlords were in control, but the central government was now strong enough to bring any of them to bear, but not all of them, and that's how they continued to survive. The Soviets went from supporting the Kuomintang to supporting the communists, who were now unable to wage open warfare and were forced to fight as guerrillas, which they continued to do until 1934, when they once again tried to fight as conventional troops, and they suffered massive defeats, so much so that they were forced to retreat in the famous Long March. In fact, there was not one long march, but a series of marches, as various communist armies, all of them defeated, in the south escaped to the north and the west. The best known is the march from Xinjiang province, which began in October 1934. The first front army of the Chinese Soviet Republic, led by an inexperienced military commission, was on the brink of annihilation by Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek's troops in their stronghold in Jiangxi province. The communists, under the eventual command of Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, escaped in a circling retreat to the west and north, which reportedly traversed over 9,000 kilometres, so that's about 6,000 miles, over 370 days. The route passed through some of the most difficult terrain of Western China by travelling west then north, and ending up in Shaanxi province. The Long March began Mao Zedong's ascent to power, whose leadership during the retreat gained him the support of the members of the party. The bitter struggles of the Long March, which was completed by only about 1/10 of the forces that had left, would come to represent a significant episode in the history of the Communist Party of China, and would seal the personal prestige of Mao and his supporters as the new leaders of the party in the following decades. Now, the Long March is actually one of the great military maneuvers in history, to actually retreat 9,000 miles and to still have any military force at the end of it. That's quite remarkable. Interesting thing is that the Communist Party was set up in 1923. The People's Liberation Army was created on the 1st of August 1927, and of course the People's Republic of China wasn't set up until 1949. So the People's Liberation Army is 22 years older than the state that it serves. Japan had not forgotten its ambitions in China, and while it had not done much during the 1920s, that was to change quite a lot in the 1930s. In September 1931, Japan seized Manchuria in northern China and installed the last emperor of China as the Emperor of Manchukuo, the new name that they gave to Manchuria. The loss of Manchuria and its vast potential for industrial development and war industries was a blow to the Kuomintang economy. The League of Nations, established at the end of World War I, was unable to act in the face of the Japanese defiance, and it was one of the first acts that would lead to the eventual destruction of the League of Nations. The Japanese began to push from the south of the Great Wall into northern China and the coastal provinces. Chinese fury against Japan was predictable, but anger was also directed against Chiang Kai-shek and the Nanking government, which at the time was more preoccupied with anti-communist extermination campaigns than with resisting the Japanese invaders. The importance of internal unity before external danger was forcibly brought home in December 1936 when Chiang Kai-shek, in an event now known as the Shaanxi incident, was kidnapped by a general and forced to ally with the communists against the Japanese in the Second Kuomintang Chinese Communist Party United Front against Japan. The Chinese resistance stiffened after the 7th July 1937 when a clash between Chinese and Japanese troops outside Peking, then named Beiping, near the Marco Polo Bridge. This skirmish led to open through undeclared warfare between China and Japan. Shanghai fell after a 3-month battle, during which Japan suffered extensive casualties both in its army and navy. The capital of Nanjing fell in December 1937. It was followed by an orgy of mass murders and rapes known as the Nanjing Massacre. The national capital was briefly at Wuhan, then removed in an epic retreat to Chongqing, the seat of government, until 1945. In 1940, the Japanese set up a collaborationist government known as the Wang Jiaying regime, and its capital was in the old capital, Nanjing. It proclaimed itself the legitimate Republic of China in opposition to Chiang Kai-shek's government, although its claims were significantly hampered due to its nature as a Japanese puppet state controlling limited amounts of territory. The united front between the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party took place with salutary effects for the beleaguered Communist Party. Despite Japan's steady territorial gains in northern China, the coastal regions and the rich Yangtze River Valley in central China. After 1940, conflicts between the Kuomintang and the Communists became more frequent in the areas not under Japanese control. The entrance of the United States into the Pacific War after 1941 changed the nature of their relationship. The Communists expanded their influence wherever opportunities presented themselves through mass organisation, administrative reforms, and land and tax measures. favouring the peasants and the spread of their organisational network, while the Kuomintang attempted to neutralise the spread of communist influence. Meanwhile, northern China was infiltrated politically by Japanese politicians in Manchukuo. In 1945, the Republic of China emerged from the war nominally a great power, but actually a nation economically prostrate and on the verge of all-out civil war. The economy deteriorated, sapped by the military demands of foreign war and internal strife, by spiralling inflation, and by nationalist profiteering, speculation, and hoarding. Starvation came in the wake of the war, and millions were rendered homeless by floods and the unsettled conditions in many parts of the country. The situation was further complicated by an Allied agreement at the Yalta Conference in February 1945 that brought Soviet troops into Manchuria to hasten the termination of the war against Japan. Although the Chinese had not been present at Yalta, they had been consulted and had agreed to have the Soviets enter the war in the belief that the Soviet Union would deal only with the Kuomintang government. After the end of the war in August 1945, the nationalist government moved back to Nanjing. With American help, nationalist troops moved to take the Japanese surrender in North China. The Soviet Union, as part of the Yalta Agreement allowing a Soviet sphere of influence in Manchuria, dismantled and removed more than half the industrial equipment left there by the Japanese. The Soviet presence in northeast China enabled the communists to move in long enough to arm themselves with the equipment surrendered by the withdrawing Japanese army. The problems of rehabilitating the formerly Japanese-occupied areas and of reconstructing the nation from the ravages of a protracted war were staggering. Between 1940 and 1945, the communists largely did not fight the Japanese. Instead, they prepared for the day when Japan would be defeated, and as they retreated, they took control of the countryside. In his search for a powerful centralized government, Chiang antagonized too many interest groups in China. Furthermore, his party was weakened in the war against the Japanese. Meanwhile, the communists targeted different groups, such as peasants, and brought them to its corner. Chiang wrote in his diary in June 1948 that the Kuomintang had failed not because of external enemies, but because of rot from within. Strong initial support from the US diminished with the failure of the Marshall Plan and then stopped completely, mainly because of Kuomintang corruption. But the regime collapsed because of military setback in northeast China. The communists, promising land reforms to the peasants, gained their popular support, and the nationalists were forced to retreat to the cities. And then when they couldn't feed the cities, they suffered military defeat, and they either had to surrender or they had to retreat. That became a cascade, especially once America had withdrawn its support from the Kuomintang, because they had great hopes for China. They had great hopes for the Kuomintang, but the Kuomintang basically threw those opportunities away. And by the end of 1949, all of mainland China was controlled by the communists, and the Kuomintang were reduced to a government in what's now Taiwan. Well, the story of China's century of humiliation is a very complex one, and if you've listened to this and you've thought, "Oh wow, that's really in depth," I've really just skimmed over the surface of the whole story, and it's been quite difficult to actually decide which parts to leave out and which parts to mention, and still have it make sense. I'm pretty happy with how I think it's turned out. Now, of course, there are 2 episodes before this, but there are also 2 episodes that I did on China in up until 1980, or the end of the Cultural Revolution, and then from the end of the Cultural Revolution till today. So I'll put those in the description box, and if you're interested, you can actually listen to 5 episodes in a row that'll tell you the history of China from the 1840s onwards. Thank you very much. If you would like to support my work, you can go to Subscribestar and help me out from as little as $1 a month. Thank you for listening, and hopefully I'll talk to you again next week. Bye-bye.